criteria. Either that it is a conflict of interest for the current government to approve of it, or that it's a long-term irreversible decision affecting all voters. Notice that these two are independent of each other. If we prove it meets either one of them, this policy is justified. So first, why it's a conflict of interest. The separation of powers and democratic checks and balances are fundamental to constitutional democracy. We believe it's a basic conflict of interest to allow governments to decide changes to the structures that are designed to keep them in check. Normally, if a corporation wants to sue a state for damages, it goes to the judiciary of that state to decide damages. But almost all FTAs today try to circumvent the judiciary through investor-state dispute settlement or ISDS clauses, in which private arbiters who are close to these MNCs decide the kind of compensation the state is due. MNCs relentlessly exploit this power to bully smaller states, the way Philip Morris sued Uruguay using ISDS when it tried to impose meaningful tobacco regulation. We think the government of the day should not be able to undermine the state judiciary because that's a basic conflict of interest. For the same reason, they should also not be able to change access to voting rights, for example. Such fundamental changes to the basic structure of the state must be ratified by the people. Second, on the irreversibility of the decision. Based on FTAs, large corporations employing millions of people can restructure their supply chains and pull out and change the way of conducting business. Pulling out of an agreement would trigger a deep recession as corporations pull out capital and cease hiring until new laws are in place to replace the old framework. This could take years, during which many will be left in abject poverty. The actual human cost of leaving an FTA is a recession that pushes thriving communities into a depressing spiral of unemployment, death, and crime. It's a moral imperative, therefore, that we recognize the right of voters to decide whether to accept the agreement in its current form rather than try to reverse it later, like we see in Brexit, which is set to trigger recession in the United Kingdom. Furthermore, FTAs often have specific clauses that create structural changes in the powers of government, like disallowing governments from pulling back liberalization or raising the minimum wage later on. This irreversibility extends to other policies and binds future governments to policies that the current government makes. The government of Egypt found this out the hard way when it was sued by the French MNC Veolia for trying to raise its minimum wage. In contrast, regular government policies like tax raises, for example, can always be reversed by the next government if the people decide they don't want it. This kind of reversibility is a key reason why representative democracy is legitimate when direct democracy is not possible. Second argument as to why FTAs are referendums lead to FTAs that better protect people's interests. But yes.
You said that a deep recession is bad. But that happened when you gave the vote to the people of the UK, which is why you had a Brexit.
Oh, that's right. We don't have to defend a Brexit-style referendum in which people can peddle lies, because when you have a referendum on an FTA, there's an actual concrete framework on which they can vote, which people can't lie about because there are actual terms in the agreement. That's why Nigel Farage is able to say, we're going to send £370 million to the NHS, because he doesn't have to make it a binding promise like there is in an FTA. So this isn't like Brexit. Second argument as to why referendums lead to FTAs that better protect people's interests. The relevance of this argument is simple. Let's be clear. We think it's overwhelmingly likely that on both sides we're going to have FTAs, because free trade can be mutually beneficial to countries, and countries want to have FTAs. Well, however, we must recognize that the effects of FTAs are distributional. That is, they affect a lot of people well, like consumers, but they also hurt a lot of other people, like people in industries and indigenous communities. These people have to all be compensated in order for the free trade agreement to be fair. What does change on our side, that FTAs are much more likely to mitigate the impacts to people who are worst affected. How is this true? First, because a referendum brings together various groups who are potentially disadvantaged by the FTA, like factory workers who lose jobs to offshoring but who need job retraining, like patients in developing countries who need access to cheap genetic medicines, like indigenous communities who need land security and livelihoods. Such diverse groups normally wouldn't unite behind a single political party that opposes FTAs during an election. They generally focus more on other issues, like LGBT rights or national security. But in a single issue referendum, they have common ground to collectivize, to campaign to the government and say, we want you to change this part of the FTA and protect our rights. And in that case, they have much more lobbying power than they would if they had to do it individually. And in that case, they can actually influence the government and make it put provisions in the FTA that make them mitigate the losses to these people, to give them job retraining, to ensure that their land rights are protected from MNCs. That's why we think our side is better. Furthermore, knowing that they will have to put the FTA up to referendum, politicians have incentives to preemptively draft favorable terms for their people into the FTA. If there are terms that are unfavorable, they might be criticized and even have electoral losses the next time. That's why they have to avoid this by putting more protection for people into the FTA. Let's look at the comparative here. In their world, politicians have the final say on FTAs. This is problematic because politicians seeking re-election are driven by short-term incentives that are at odds with the long-term and irreversible nature of an FTA. Subsidies, tariffs have to be phased out over a period of time. This means that
Sorry, you've got 30 seconds.
Yeah, this means that MNCs take time to establish supply chains, and that means that politicians will only care about the short term because they get some sort of economic optimism, a rise in the stock market, a brief inflow of capital that can ride them to victory in the next election. But 15 years down the line, they might get sued through ISDS or be forced to stop raising the minimum wage. They don't have the chance, they don't really care about that because of their incentive structure. So for Team Philippines to win this debate, they need to demonstrate why voters are not legitimate in deciding their own future. They need to demonstrate how on their side they can still have benefits to voters when corporations are the only people who draft FTAs. Because referendums make free trade, fair trade, we're incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you, Carter, for your speech. I'd now like
Oh,
to
sorry, if you can give us just 20 seconds before calling on the next speaker. And also, just to double check with timing, it's one bell at 1 minute, one bell at 7 minutes, and then two bells at 8 minutes. Just to double check.
so 5 seconds.
Thank you very much.
Bei den Reply-Speeches bei 4:30 auch nicht andauernd, oder? Weil hier steht jeweils 30 Minuten doppelt. Okay. Thank you, Kartik, for your speech. I'd now like to call Francis Broderick from the opposition.
Sorry.
Since the beginning of democracy, there has always been an inherent tension between electing people to represent you and getting your personal voice heard in a democratic space. In our end, we believe that democracy is not just about the voice of the people, but it is also about institutions, ladies and gentlemen. Side opposition admits that there are no perfect ways to deal with this, that neither the politician nor the person is perfect. But on balance, who has the proper mandate and capability to represent the people? On balance, what leads to better outcomes and who is the proper representative for this decision? I have two arguments to answer this question. The first is about who has the mandate. The second is about who represents more and who represents better. And we think that the answer to those two questions is simply the lawmaker. So let's move on to my rebuttals to the case made by the previous speaker. Because he told us in his model that only 50% it will only be ratified if more than 50% will vote. Well, if that's true, ladies and gentlemen, then you're never going to get anything ratified in the very first place. But that is a very concession that voting won't be compulsory, and I will be tackling that later on in my arguments. No, thank you, sir. Then, they tell us that politicians have the final say, essentially, and that's why it's simply okay to allow people to make these types of decisions. But we have to clarify what exactly this motion entails, ladies and gentlemen, especially in the context of ratification. Ratifying means that the negotiations of the treaty have already happened, ladies and gentlemen, that the state has already agreed on the terms of the treaty, and they're simply asking the people if it's a yes or if it's a no, and if it's about translating it into law. So no, we don't think that politicians do have the final say on their side of the house. Let's talk about their next idea. They told us in their first argument that, it's the people are the legitimate authority on FTAs. Because on their side of the house, there is somehow this conflict of interest and you end up undermining internal sovereignty. Well, firstly, we don't think that you end up undermining internal sovereignty because these people did elect these lawmakers into power. But secondly, even if you do have less internal sovereignty, we think that on our side of the house, that's okay. Because you do get sovereignty in other ways. You have external sovereignty when you get recognized by the international international community through free trade agreements, when you're able to expand your power
Point of information.
through that. And then they tell us, right, the idea of how we don't have to defend the Brexit, ladies and gentlemen. It's not in our burden. But ladies and gentlemen, the Brexit is a debate about FTAs. The Brexit is a debate about the joining or leaving the European Union. So yes, we think it is relevant and we think it is about FTAs on our side of the house. Then they tell us that it affects a lot of people essentially, and that's why it's important to have these people into power, to have the voters into power. Well, firstly, we think that they are already properly represented on our side of the house. Why? We think that you have the existence of caucuses, ladies and gentlemen. You have politicians consulting representatives of pertinent issues and pertinent causes in town hall meetings, and we think that people are already sufficiently represented when it comes to them being stakeholders. But secondly, we think that the idea of lobbying happens on our side of the house as well. We think that you still have people being able to create lobbying groups and lobbying for power. We don't think it's mutually exclusive on their side. Before I move on.
Do you support the exclusion of voting rights based on a knowledge test?
Wait, sorry, can you please repeat?
Do you support the exclusion of voting rights based on a knowledge test?
Thank you for that point. Because he asks us if we support the exclusion based on like a knowledge test. No, ladies and gentlemen, because when you talk about voting, we think that it's different when it comes to elections. Because you're talking about people who do have a multiplicity of issues in mind. But we think that it's different when it comes to referendums because inherently, we don't think that people have the proper, sufficient economic knowledge to be able to make these decisions. Let's move on to my first argument about who exactly has the mandate to make these decisions. Okay, let's compare the accountability of lawmakers and people. We think that lawmakers are accountable to a multiplicity of interests. They are accountable to their individual constituents, to the collective good of their state, and to trade partners and allies, all of which are important actors in the development of the state. But we think that if politicians had to choose, we think that they would choose the common good of the state at hand. No, thank you. So let's compare now. Who are people accountable to? They are accountable to their very small spheres of influence, to their families, to their friends, to their job security. And we think that while these may be valid, they tend to be self-interested and myopic when it comes to making these decisions. Moreover, we think that these concerns may conflict with the common good that lawmakers are trying to protect. For instance, in Detroit, when you have the car industry starting to die and starting to become uncompetitive, the people still supported subsidizing it even if it was inefficient. Moreover, so thank you, farmers in the Philippines clamored for the state to not import food during a time of food scarcity, ladies and gentlemen. These are facts, and these examples already demonstrate the fact that people may have concerns that conflict with the common good for them and what may be good in the long term. So we think that lawmakers on our side of the house are better at being able to balance these multiplicities of interests. They're better at being able to balance this with the common good. And we think that they will balance the concerns of these individuals anyway. No, thank you. It's not like these people won't be represented. We think that they'll just be balanced with other concerns that these politicians have to consider. Well, we think that they will end up reaching a compromise concerning this. Next, let's move on to this next layer of this argument about the idea of accountability. Because this questions, what exactly happens when mistakes are made and when people are not informed? We think that the consequences tend to differ for both actors, ladies and gentlemen. For lawmakers, the consequences tend to be quite grave. We think that if they failed to read the free trade agreement properly, we think that their colleagues tend to get mad at them for being lazy bums. They won't rise up party ranks. Moreover, they won't get re-elected, and we think that they'll also be demonized by the media and by other organizations right now. So we think that the consequences tend to be more grave. Moreover, when it comes to non-politicians, what's the very worst case scenario? That their friends joke them, that their friends troll them. We don't think that you'll have any grave consequences when it comes to this. Therefore, we think that politicians tend to become more accountable, and therefore we think that they do have the mandate for this decision. Before I move on. Yes.
If you think lawmakers are more economically sophisticated, do you support having educational qualifications become an MP or replacing illiterate MPs with bankers and professors?
When it comes to politicians making these decisions, we think that they also consult a variety of experts. So no, we don't think that they do have to make those requirements. We don't think that's necessary at the end of the day. So let's move on to my second argument about who represents more and who represents better. We think that the results of a referendum are high stakes and tend to cut across generations, and we think that you're talking about people who can and will be affected by such a decision. But since they've already said, right, that they won't make voting compulsory, we think it leads to low voter turnouts. Like for instance, in the Brexit. So why is it justified that 37% of Britons are able to decide for 200% of the British population? Well, No, my math is not wrong, ladies and gentlemen, because it cuts across those who are already living and those who are already voting. We think it also affects people who will be born in the future, who will face the consequences of a Brexit and other such trade referenda. So is this democratic? No, because we think it's more democratic if you rely on other structures of democracy that tend to represent the voiceless people as we speak. We think that, for instance, you're relying on representatives who can represent everyone in society or everyone who is affected right now. You're talking about them representing children, representing the international community in these pertinent issues already. You're talking about caucuses who will be represented in town hall meetings, who are the relevant stakeholders at hand. But what happens under their model? We think that their model allows a group of a few old people to hijack particular causes, like what happened already in the Brexit. So what exactly happens? You make children and you make people in the future pay for their self-interest and pay for their myopia. We think that on their side, if democracy is about representation, we think that opposition believes it's about representing people who don't have a voice in society. We think that on their side, they deprive people of a voice, especially in the future, when you rely on people who are voting right now. Therefore, we think that their model is inherently flawed. So for all these reasons, we beg to oppose.
Thank you, Francis, for your speech. I'd now like to call Hammond from the opposition.
Go Heyman.
Many of Philippines' arguments today are problems with elections overall. Imperfections in voters' abilities to collect and process information cannot be enough of a reason to take away their right to be represented, their right to be heard. Democracy doesn't provide moral superiority on the basis of technical knowledge, especially when the trade-off is irreversible systems which are entrenched the technocratic elite. What were the major things that we heard from them today? The most important argument from side opposition was that there was a common good that was created. First of all, we ask you, what is this common good? When there is a significant human cost to this growth, like we already set up in our first speech, when indigenous communities, generic medicines not being allowed, therefore the poor dying, when factory workers, and when multiple similar groups are systematically displaced and denied basic economic opportunity and quality of life, is this human cost worth this growth at all? But let's contest if this growth happens at all in the first place. We think at the point at which there is no economic consensus, like we already told you in our first speech again, when people are still debating whether we have to go with austerity or Keynesian economics, what level of interventionism is good, we think it is pretty much redundant for them to say that this is an objective good in economics. But secondly, we think this objective good is tainted with economists who believe in certain ideologies manipulating variables to suit those outcomes and to create suitable outcomes. But even if we were to discount all of this and assume that there was an objective good and that there was an actual growth, is it worth the human cost? Should we be allowed to make this moral judgment at all? Especially in their conclusion of their first speech, when they told you that generations of children are affected. Given that even as a result of FTAs, generations of children can be affected, as technocratic elite, should we be allowed to make this decision as to what is better, human cost versus macroeconomic growth? And the fact that they assert that the macroeconomic growth is more important means that their idea of what trade-off is good is imposed by their privilege. Because we tell you that we should not be allowed to make this moral judgment, and also told you in our first speech that this moral judgment, if made, only favors us, and that as a result of all of this confusion, the voters who are most affected should be allowed to make this decision for themselves, we are happy to tell you that referendums make free trade fair trade. What was the next thing they had to tell us? The principal attacks here. They told you that in their first speech, they told us that they'll tackle it in their argument and then just pretended like the argument was never made and forgot about it. But then the only thing they said was that the government was a sovereign representative of the people. This was completely ignorant of the two criteria we set right in our first speech. One, irreversibility of the decision, and two, change in state structures and therefore a conflict of interest. And automatically, by not engaging with this, they've conceded our principle. We absolutely win on principle. But when we attack them, they told us, no, lobbying happens, yes, because exactly when they concede that lobbying happens on their side of the house for politicians, we tell you it's disproportionately higher done by MNCs, and therefore the consultants that they also concede work with these politicians are representatives of these MNCs. Therefore, again, when compared to our second argument, where we told you that actual people who are affected can now unite in elections and that this causes better negotiations, and when they didn't engage with this, and when we asked them in a POI about technocracy, they told you, no, people don't know economics. We think all that they've been doing so far is arguments against democracy, whereas we've been showing you why the people have a right to determine their own futures. Finally, this idea of a Brexit. We told you the Brexit was voted in ambiguity. It was a voting after which the framework was going to be formed. This is uniquely different from FTAs, where an existing framework is voted upon, and once again, typically of Team Philippines, they just ignored that analysis. What is my constructive today? Voters on aggregate are likely to make better decisions than politicians and corporations on trade agreements. My first speaker already told you how FTAs make a trade-off between harms and benefits that occur at different periods of time. As a consequence of this, I'll be showing you how the nexus between the political elite and corporations cannot be trusted to make this decision. How so? Firstly, we think politicians are restricted and influenced by tools that disable them to make legitimate and inclusive trade-offs. How does this happen? First, corporations fund re-election campaigns of politicians. That is to say, through targeted lobbying, they achieve the ability to structurally influence political decision making. For example, by spending more on the 2016 US elections than the Democratic or Republican parties, the Koch brothers obtained pervasive influence on US energy policy. In this way, corporations ensure that general elections don't address FTAs and limit public discourse on FTAs too. Second, we think there's a revolving door between politics and business. For example, when Vice President Dick Cheney goes to war in Iraq and then goes back to running Halliburton, we think that's a fundamental conflict of interest and perverse incentive to politicians to operate from. Thirdly, this lack of challenging politicians is supplemented when, in the absence of a referendum, 24/7 profit-driven corporate media doesn't have an incentive to cover this due to insufficient public interest and therefore fails to check politicians. Finally, we think parliamentarians operate out of a confirmation bias. MNC representatives, lobbyists, and macroeconomists, the consultants that inform politicians on their side of the house, actually cement skewed political opinions by systematically underplaying the harms of trade. But secondly, politicians, we argue, are cemented into elitist views by virtue of coming from similar backgrounds. That is to say that they are detached from the reality of their people's sufferings. By being socio-economically advantaged white or upper caste men, they're insulated from the harms of FTAs but enjoy its benefits. I'll take you.
Your beautiful referendums was used in Switzerland to be able to ban minarets. These are Muslim towers put in near Muslim mosques. How is that fair?
So let's take the logical conclusion of this principle. Republican voters in the US who want to vote for Trump should be denied the right to vote. Voters across the state who want to vote for harmful policies should be denied the right to vote. That is not how democracy works. Unless and until you support and hardline complete technocracy, this is the same kind of thing that also happens on your side of the house. So what is the impact of the problems that I've told you already? Well, politicians cannot display the public will on issues most voters no one care about. It's much easier to prioritize corporations by downplaying free trade agreements. This is how, for example, the Obama administration went directly into voting for the ratification of the TPP without even discussing amendments. By structurally disallowing this through a referendum, we ensure better outcomes from FTAs. 1. Politicians who just quietly collude and pass FTAs on their side of the house now have to compete and pick stances in front of the public. This is supplemented when there is multifaceted media coverage as a result of the FTA becoming the biggest story. Second, the social media supplements this by creating separate cycles of coverage when individuals read stories and share it. Voters also have much less preconceived notions when the time they've been exposed to lobbies is less, and blocks of groups like farmers and factory workers can actually lobby them and provide counter narratives. But finally, even in their best case, honest politicians are still compromised by the threat of attack ads and blinded by their own privilege. Only us allow the people who are most affected to use their knowledge of what they need and make flexible decisions for themselves. Referendums make free trade fair trade.
Thank you, Hemant, for your speech. I'd now like to call Ignacio from the opposition.
Just before you start, can I remind all coaches that you're forbidden from communicating with teams during this debate. So you're permitted to give hand signals that indicate the time left in the speaker's speech, but you're not allowed to use any gestures other than a still hand signal. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think Team India has a listening problem. Because their only response that they had to our arguments is to say, we don't have a response to their arguments. But in fact, we did. And I'll show you throughout my speech how we actually took down their case. Before I move on to my argument about how in the instance of free trade treaties, there are better democratic structures than referenda, let's move on to a few levels of rebuttal. The first thing I want to take down is a burden push that they tried to impose on us coming from there. They tried to tell us that we have to defend that free trade agreements are always better and that they're objectively good. Clearly, they weren't listening. Because coming from our first opposition speaker, we said that it's not about whether or not free trade agreements are always better than not free trade agreements, but it's a question of who should make that decision and who's the most qualified person to make that decision. In fact, they conceded that there is so much confusion into what is the best good of whether or not free trade agreements are actually beneficial. So if that's the concession that they make, how can we rely on people who are informed about macroeconomic policies, who aren't informed about free trade agreements, to make that decision for them? If experts can't do it under their model, then what more the regular people who are not dumb, but are not informed about these specific things that are very esoteric and all that. But secondly, they try to accuse us of not responding to their principle. The principle in which, because there's so much, the free trade agreements affect so much within a state, we have to give that decision to other people. Clearly, again, they weren't listening. Because we responded to this on two levels. We said, first, that the mandate is better in from our first opposition speaker. That yes, you don't have a direct democracy, but since you elected these politicians, they have a mandate to take care of them. In fact, their mandate is greater because they have greater levels of accountability. No, thank you. Which is like the common good, for instance, these individuals and the international community. We had no response coming from them. But secondly, we told you that this sovereignty is expanded. That yes, you might have to go through international courts, for instance, but the fact that your state can use international courts to try to go against or try to check and balance the abuses of other states, then you also have your sovereignty expanded. So it's not a zero, not all your sovereignty is always being lost. So in terms of principle, we think that they failed to engage us. Next, let's talk about lobbying. This is where a lot of their case started to hinge, right? Where the politicians are unqualified for making the decision because they're lobbyists. Our first response is this. If you look at America, the three biggest lobbying groups are the NRA, the farmers' lobby, and the teachers' lobby. That means the multinational corporations take a back seat towards the rest of the farmer lobby. Yes, they might be not as rich as farmers' corporations, multinational corporations, but because they have a lot of them, they're able to pool the resources and create effective change. But secondly, we think that lobbying is part of the democratic process. If they want to defend democracy in their side of the house, then they have to defend the right to organize. In fact, Bernie Sanders' campaign was not funded by multinational corporations, it was funded by regular individuals. But more than that, that even if lobbying, they say that lobbying can't, you can lobby for groups, or these multinational corporations are incredibly powerful. We think that if rich corporations can buy politicians, then why can't rich corporations buy the public? In fact, they've done this, right? In the Brexit, for instance, where Nigel Farage spent 15.6 million euros in trying to create ads and advertisements to convince the people to go against the Brexit. Or in the NAFTA, for instance, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, where the Republicans ran an expensive anti-Bill Clinton campaign to try to convince people to go against the North American Free Trade Agreement. We think their side of the house shows that if that's money is the problem, then it might exist on both sides of the house as well. But lastly, we think that they tell us that politicians will hide the free trade agreements, like the TPP, for instance, because we're going to hide it. But that's the point. The debate was never about negotiating for free trade agreements. It was about ratifying them. And my first speaker already clarified this, right? He said the process of ratification happens when you already have the agreement, and all the state will do is translate it into law. Meaning, all the details of that agreement will be public because it's part of your state legislature, and all of the documents are public there. So you don't understand the secrecy behind these politicians, but politicians already. So now let's move on to my argument. But before I move on, yes.
Should presidents be allowed to determine their own term limits?
We think, Mr. that is a different debate, first and foremost, with presidents being able to determine the term limits. But secondly, yes, you can have a constitutional referendum for that, and constitutional convention for that, and you need the legislature for that as well. So you still have the need for the legislature. We don't necessarily think that's inherently important. And in fact, presidents determining the term limits doesn't justify their power, or it's not the same as free trade agreements. They have to be able to justify that. Now let's move on to my argument about how in the instance of free trade treaties, there are better democratic structures than referendum. We recognize that citizens were not born with the right to vote. It is the right that you acquired as you grow in age. In some countries, it's 16, in others, it is 18. This means that the right to vote, is not something that you grant blankly. Why? Because you are able to vote in a general elections, and this is where we differentiate from general elections to referendum, because if you are 18, because the state recognizes that you have sufficient lived experience to be able to know the general direction of your country that your country should take. And this is different from the other, different from referendums, because general elections are very general, meaning politicians still have wiggle room in order to make negotiations along party lines. This doesn't happen under their model, because the moment you sign into a free trade agreement or not, you have no other option to make sure that the harms are not drastically there. But this is why non-citizens are not allowed to vote. The next premise is this. This demonstrates that direct voting in democracy correlates with the degree of experience a person would have in that vote. Unlike elections, free trade agreements are so specific. They're complicated and binding. This is different from general elections, where there is a space for policies to be negotiated across party lines. Given that it is not a natural born right, then, why do we believe lawmakers are better than the common people in making this decision? Obviously, the common people are not as experienced in the field. While we recognize that some politicians may not be as good, but at the very least, they have a mandate to be able to learn these things. They have advisors to help them and force them to understand what the free trade agreement means. And we think that, to be clear, the common people are not that dumb, right? We don't argue that they are dumb, but their experiences in other things, like working, for instance, like being able to feed their family. So free trade agreements are very esoteric, right? The interaction between the goods market, which is supply and demand, and its intersection with the monetary market, which is very, very complicated and very, very hard to understand. Every punctuation matters in a free trade agreement. That's why it takes years for us to have this negotiation. That's why we think that there's no way to simplify and distill this free trade agreement into one without jeopardizing the accuracy of the movement itself, jeopardize accuracy of the agreement itself. This means that most people who are not lawmakers, having no experience with the intricacies of trade agreements, become vulnerable to its lies and manipulation. In a referendum, we recognize that some people will tell them the truth and will tell them facts. But we now live in a post-factual democracy. It is no longer a question of what is true, but what appeals to emotions. Our democracy can be hijacked by ultranationalist, xenophobic, populist sentiments. In Wales, for instance, the UKIP was elected on the Brexit agenda by spreading ultranationalism and lies about the national healthcare system, about building bridges in the EU and not having a natural identity. So what we think is that a lot of times these people vote and regret their votes. This happened in the Brexit, where the next day individuals started turning away or like asking if they can have a revote already. We think that the debate is about who makes the best decision. We've substantially proven to you why lawmakers do, and that's why we're very proud to oppose. Thanks.
Thank you, Ignacio, for your speech. I'd now like to call Dhananjay from India.
Where's your phone log? Can I start?
Yeah, sorry, just before you do, also, just a note to all speakers, if you want to refer to me in this debate, feel free to call me Madam Speaker.
You do not have the right to defend yourself. As a farmer living in Indonesia, you do not have the right to defend yourself from an FTA that will surely take your job. As a General Motors worker in Detroit, you do not have the right to even voice your concerns against a free trade agreement that is going to surely make sure that your family starves for the years to come. You don't have the right to even voice that concern out, just for the general good of the public, despite the fact that you are the public. That is what opposition has been telling you from the very start of this debate, and we detest that. We say that referendums make free trade fair trade. So before I get on to the major clash points in this debate, let's look at a direct point which their second speaker told us. They told you the general elections, you weren't born with the right to vote. No. See, political representation is a right. It's a right which we give to absolutely everyone who is a citizen of our country. Even immigrants who eventually become citizens get that right to vote. We just give this to the parents of children at that point in time because their rights are being represented. That's why there's already debates on trying to lower the voting age to make sure that people can better represent themselves. And we believe that the right to vote is inherent. And firstly, they contradict themselves when they told you in their first speaker, when we asked them a POI, would you make voting rights based on knowledge? They said no. They conceded that knowledge should not play a part as to whether or not you get to cast a vote on either side of the house, and as a result, that entire argument falls on the basis of a contradiction. General elections are intentionally made not about FTAs. Now, general elections has been their go-to model on their side of the house. I'll show you how general elections are the worst way of getting the opinion out on the FTAs. So what is the first point in today's debate? The most important point is the legislation the true legitimizer of an FTA. What did we tell you under this? We told you three things. Firstly, conflict of interest. We told you we don't think that, say, the president should be able to redefine the terms of the president. They agreed to that. They agreed that, in principle, an actor should not be able to control that actor themselves. That's exactly what's happening in an FTA. We showed you that when governments pass FTA, they limit the powers of their judiciary for 20 years in the future. They limit the powers of future governments to do things like welfare schemes, to have things like patent protection for their own people. It's definitely infringing on the power of their own government for years to come. They only came up here and told you that it's legitimate because they were voted in. They told you that governments are the representative of the people. But then they came up and told you that the people are not representative of the people. We don't understand what they mean when they say this. We'd say that their entire principle on how it's not a conflict of interest is saying that these politicians are elected by the people and therefore their viewpoint. They're conceding that we need to take the public's view on certain FTAs on this point of time. We tell you that by taking the public's view through a referendum, it's much more effective, it's much more healthy, it's legitimate. That was the conflict of interest. Next, the points which they ignored altogether. We told you irreversibility. Things like an FTA take an extremely long time to take impact, and it largely is very difficult to exit. It has massive impacts on everyone, on every single person, and it's very difficult to reverse. We gave you this analysis in our first speech, no rebuttal. They've conceded that it is irreversible. They've conceded that in fact, that same government won't be in play. We asked them We asked them to tell us why one government that's voted in right now, which will lose its term in the next 5 years, and we may not even know if it still has popular support in the future, has the right to define the powers of the government for the next 25 years to come. They have not responded to that basic question on irreversibility. And therefore, we win this debate on principle alone. They contradicted themselves, in fact, when they spoke a lot about future generations. We tell you, people are more likely to be truly representative of future generations simply because they are the people. They care about their children and their grandchildren. They care about the future of their country, and they care about themselves and their future. And as a result, they're more likely to be representative of future generations as well. And as a result, we win on the point of legitimacy alone. I'll take you if you have it.
Sir, if old people are supposed to be representative of the new generation, then why is it in the Brexit 60% of those over 60 voted for to leave?
Thank you, sir. I'll get to you and rebut how your only example of a bad FTA is Brexit, and you would mention that every single time you want to point out a bad example. I'll get to how that example is not valid on our side of the house. Now, firstly, on which side are FTAs better for the people? What did we tell you? We told you FTAs exist on both sides of the house. They're extremely good if they're done in the right way. The problem is the way they are negotiated with right now. What did we tell you? We said that we're going to have collectivizing of minorities when you have their ability to lobby together and build up. No response from their side of the house on that part. We told you how it's a single issue, people are going to be interested, how they're going to read up and they're likely to make better choices. No response on that either.
Point.
What did they tell you on their side of the house? They told you that poor people are only accountable to themselves and therefore conflicts with the common good. Nonsense. Since when do we ever say that poor people can't vote for their own common good? Are we saying that every single person in a democracy has to calculate what is good for other people and vote it? No. The ideals of democracy is that people care about themselves and voice their opinions as to what they think affects themselves best. We're not saying that if the indigenous people believe they don't totally agree with an FTA, it's automatically going to be shut down, right? We believe that if at 51% or 60% of your population individually feel that an FTA is bad, it's not common good anymore, it's bad. And as a result, we shouldn't have it. And they haven't really responded to the idea that there's no objective common good. They in fact came up here and told us in the second speaker that there is a bunch of problems with economics. Now that brings me on to the main clash in this debate on the outcomes rather, which actor is the best. What did we tell you? We told you politicians, which are their actors for crafting FTAs right now, are illegitimately placed. Firstly, through our principled arguments on how they're not the true actors there, and secondly, on outcomes. We told you lobbying, we told you confirmation bias, we told you eliteness, and we really heard no response from their side of the house on any of these. What does this mean for our case as a whole? This means we've proved to you politicians are less likely to be the true representative of the people's will. They're less likely to have this common good in mind and more likely to have the common good of a few elite minds, of a few lobbied people, of a few corporates. And as a result, they're not going to be the true representatives of the people. Who are going to be the true representatives of the people? We say the people. And they tried saying that the people are going to be lobbied as well. Firstly, that's extremely less likely. It's very difficult to lobby a farmer to support an FTA that is surely going to destroy his life. We say that the people will be smart, that media attention on referendums is going to be massive because referendums are an extremely big thing. People are likely to be informed, they're likely to know the effect that FTA has on their life, and they're likely to cast the vote properly. We cannot assume that they don't have the ability to make this judgment for themselves. Their example on the Brexit falls simply because, like we've told you in our first two speeches together, it wasn't based on a structure, and they haven't responded to that analysis. So at the end of this debate, what do FTAs look like on both sides? We said that there's a problem right now with the way negotiations happen. The public are getting disadvantaged in FTAs, and they have no way to change that. That basic premise has not been rebutted, in fact, by opposition. They at no point of time came up here and defended the ways FTAs exist in real life now. They conceded there was a problem, never told you how they're going to solve said problem. They're just supporting a status quo that condemns people to death. We've shown you how referendums make free trade fair trade. How the people are the true legitimizers. FTAs are better on our side of the house. Very proud to propose.
Thank you, Dhananjay, for your speech. I'd now like to call queries from the opposition.
Yeah, just before you begin, a reminder to the audience that we really need you to be silent. It's a very small room, and we can hear you when you whisper. So just so we can give full attention to the speakers, please save your thoughts about the debate until the end of it, which will be happening very soon.
When the NAFTA was ratified by the lawmakers of the US, we don't think the effects were actually bad. It actually led to a 30% rise in exports for them, right? But when you left the decision in the hands of the people, there were several examples when it failed, right? Not just the Brexit. There was when the Greek voters voted against a bailout that would leave them in a default, right? But this was overruled by Tsipras because he recognized that it was important for him to be able to impose austerity measures to prevent like economic crisis for their people. Or even the example of the minarets, right, where people, when it was left to the people, they were allowed to exclude the minority, and these were the people that were harmed. On their side, they had to be able to defend that there are instances where, when left in the hands of people, the decision will lead to catastrophic results. They cannot simply say that they don't like what happened in the Brexit, because that is a great and current example of how referendums are a dangerous power that we will be giving to people. We say that even on their side, the people regretted their own decisions, right? They recognized that they were ill-informed. They started searching what happens now that we're out of the EU and wanted to be able to overturn their votes. Ladies and gentlemen, their side simply argued for a direct democracy. If you listen to the way they argued, they simply said that we want people's voices to be heard all the time. Then why is it that they still have representatives and politicians, right? They needed to be able to differentiate that. Coming from our side, we told you, the idea of politicians is that you are able to vote for people who represent you, who represent your different concerns. But when it comes to FTAs, it requires your specific knowledge on those agreements. It requires a more complex understanding of it. Before I move on, yes.
Who gets to decide whether 30% increase in trade is worth the loss of 600,000 jobs and 1 million trade deficit?
The politicians you voted for to represent you, plus the people they consult, who are economists, who are experts, who understand the nuances of a free trade agreement, right? So this is the first question we need to ask in this debate. Where do we best actually exercise and uphold the idea of democracy? We say it's not always just about having your voice heard, but it's about having representation across the board and having accountability. Coming from First Prop, they said, well, now we finally allow poor farmers and lobby groups to be heard. Funny that they didn't know we already have caucuses or we have town hall meetings where you do consult lobby groups like the NRA, teachers lobby, farmers lobby, in order for them to be able to represent and talk about their concerns, right? We say that even in this instance, these people have money and numbers which the politicians will be taking into account. When we told them this, all they said was, lobby groups are good. Yeah, exactly, right? That's what we have on our side of the house. So at best, their policy is unnecessary. Moving on. So why is the representation that we have on our side better? We told you coming from First Opp already that lawmakers are answerable to constituents, the common good, and also international trade partners. What did we hear coming from them? Nothing, right? They were never even willing to engage this idea coming from my first speaker. So what? We say, on our side, it will be better on balance, because not only are you concerned about what your citizens will think because you want to be re-elected or because you don't want to be shamed, but more importantly, you will think long term. You will also be consulting economic experts and all of that. Versus people on their side who vote in self-interest, which isn't necessarily wrong, but that self-interest contradicts and conflicts with the idea of common good. And that is why we say, on our side, it is a better exercise of democracy where you have people who represent everybody across the board and aren't representing only themselves. Before I move on, yeah.
Engage with my comparative on the powers, incentives, and confirmation bias out of which politicians operate.
Okay, but if lawmakers have a perverse incentive, don't you think that's even greater for the people who don't have a job? Oh, they're just answerable to the people, right? Because people can vote however they want and in their own self-interest, but lawmakers, no matter what their self-interest, will still have to answer to the people, right? So this is the next question we need to ask. in which democratic structure will this actually lead to the optimum decision being made? They said there is no objective good in economics. Objectively, the Brexit was bad because it led to the greatest devaluation of the pound, and it led to an economic crisis in their side, right? So we think that there are the better decisions, even though there aren't necessarily the good, there isn't necessarily a right decision, right? So where do we analyze what is an optimum decision? One, where it concerns the common good, and second, where the decision was made rationally. And this rationale is where the people are most informed, where people are most experienced with what they are voting for, and where people are not susceptible to propaganda. This is where we analyze the two stakeholders who will be making that vote, right? The lawmakers versus the people. First, their policy was, mandatory voting. What does that mean, right? That people who don't care, who won't read the free trade agreement, who don't really understand what it means, can vote whatever they want because they have to, right? So we think even on their side, it is more dangerous because you're leaving it in the hands of people who know nothing at all. But more importantly, we think that these people have other concerns as well, right? The idea of their work, their jobs, their families, and also that these people think short term in that sense. But lastly, we told you that these people are vulnerable to propaganda, and we heard no response coming from them. They just said, well, politicians are also susceptible to propaganda. We don't think that's a proper response. But conversely, we told you, for lawmakers, it is their job to be able to understand these things, to consult experts. And every day they have access to this text. Every day they must be trying to understand what this free trade agreement could mean for their country. No, thank you. Coming from first prop, they said, FTAs are bad because there are short-term benefits that lead to long-term consequences. Actually, free trade agreements mean sacrifices in the short term, right? Like the job loss you were talking about, like the industries dying out. So actually, you just conceded short-sightedness is bad, where actually short-sightedness works on your side of the house, where people are just thinking about them losing their jobs now, versus the idea of economic growth or getting cheaper goods, which takes time, right? So when we told you that, well, we gave you the example, for example, Detroit, right, where they tried to protect a dying industry, although it would have been better to simply let it die out. We think on their side of the house, that is where you have outcomes where people are trying to protect jobs, even at the cost of economic growth. Lastly, they said that, well, now FTAs will be better for the people because now they get a voice and they get to negotiate. If you listen to our first op, we already told you this isn't about the negotiation. The terms have already been negotiated. It's about people ratifying that law that was already negotiated. But more importantly, already people are represented because there are lobby groups being able to get their voices heard. But more importantly, they conceded from first prop that FTAs are already good. What does this mean? It means that politicians wouldn't have signed into an agreement that they thought wouldn't be beneficial for their state anyway, right? But their analysis was that, well, now politicians will be criticized if they present a policy that is bad to the vote. Same banana, right? If they ratify something that is bad, then they will also be criticized. So we don't think their policy was even necessary, and we even brought to you the greater repercussions that these people suffered. So we think that even the idea of being influenced and being manipulated is so much worse on their side of the house, where lobby groups are able to spend 15.6 million in the Leave campaign to lie to you about the benefits of a Brexit. So if you don't want a Brexit to happen again, stand with opposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarice, for your speech. It's now my pleasure to ask Ignacio to give the opposition's reply speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chair, I want to distill this debate into two questions. A question about consistency in stances, and secondly, on responsiveness and engagement. Firstly, on consistency. Because they tried to accuse us of a lot of contradictions, which are not really contradictions, right? Let's look at them. They accused us of having contradiction between elections and referendum. Because apparently, a referendum is the same thing as an election. But they failed to listen to our distinctions. We said that general elections set the general direction for your society. So politicians still have wiggle room to change things, to make negotiations, etc., etc. Versus a referendum, which is specific, which is direct, and which is very, very complicated characterizations they never responded to. But secondly, they tried to give us a contradiction again about the conflict of interest. Apparently, when a president, we said that the president has, can extend his powers. No, we never said that. We said that the president has Congress to extend his powers. So it's not a conflict of interest because you're two separate bodies. If you understand the separation of powers, then you know that they're not the same entities at the end of the day. So don't necessarily think that that was a contradiction as well. In fact, I think they accuse us of contradictions because they were hiding behind their oath. What I'm talking about? So when they concede that it will make voting mandatory, they recognize that the voice of the people is not always the most important thing. Because if the voice of the people is so important, then you should have given the people the right not to be represented in elections, not to participate in these elections. But instead, that means that there might be some overarching goals that the state has over that voice of the people, even if it might affect them better or worse. We think then that contradiction under the model was never resolved. But secondly, they told us that the Brexit is bad, right? When you POI them, they said it's bad, but it's not part of this debate because it's a different kind of referendum. But you ask them, why is it different? They said that they will. The third proposition said that he will defend it, but he never gave us a distinction. Why is it so different, right? Because even if you can't peddle lies or you try to improve the situation, the fact remains that some people will still be myopic and not be able to fully understand free trade agreements in making a kind of decision under their model. The fact that they conceded the Brexit was bad shows that their policy has created harms that are very hard to reverse. Now let's look at responsiveness. Because they're very, very dismissive of our case. My first opposition speaker talked about being democratic, about having more accountability, like politicians are being more accountable to different community, the international community, and the common good. And you give a comparison of accountability between an individual and a politician. But you had no response towards this. And it shows that it means that the accountability, if you talk this way about accountability, then we think it's better under a model because you're able to check and balance different conflicting interests that exist. Or in my other partner's second argument, where how the representing of the people includes children, those who can't vote yet, those who are unborn. All they said was this: grannies and grandmothers or grandfathers will be able to vote for their children because they care about their future. Then I asked the POI, then why did they vote to Brexit to leave? They said they'll answer it later, no actual answer coming from their speech. So that means that if you talk about representation and democracy, the best arbiters or the best representatives of those who are in the future, who by the way will be most affected by these free trade agreements, are the politicians who have an incentive because they want to continue their legacy in the future. These are your future voters, and if you screw them over, they won't vote for you and they don't have that kind of legacy to uphold. And lastly, they didn't respond to my case either, about how you're unable to make the decisions because of the complexity of free trade agreements. When we live in a post-factual democracy where lies can be peddled so easily and people believe in a more myopic view of individuals. This means that because it's very complex, they seem to have conceded to that characterization, which means they have no answer whatsoever to how are people best able to represent themselves when they don't necessarily know their interests. So if you talk about democracies, we don't think about just about getting the voice or letting people speak. It's about getting the best voice and getting the best representation for the people we're very proud to oppose. Thanks.
Thank you. It's now my pleasure to ask Kartik to finish this debate and give the propositions reply speech.
Let's get one thing clear from the start. This debate does not take place in China. Legitimacy in a democratic state arises from the people. That's a fundamental truth to this debate, and that's what we've been pushing from the very beginning when we tell you that referendums make free trade fair trade. Team Philippines failed to recognize this and thought that legitimacy can come from the common good, some warped perception of net utility that ignores people's rights to represent themselves and to defend their own cause. A dubious and diaphanous concept that they hinged their entire case on. Maybe if we were in China, then that case would stand. But we don't, and it doesn't work that way. They needed to show how people don't have the right to vote in their own interest. Obviously, we recognize that they would. They didn't justify why it's a bad thing. They just took that as a premise and said somehow voting in your own interest is bad. We didn't hear any justification from them on that. They tried to defend a status quo where 600 companies can write the TPP, but the text is secret from the public, but they simply couldn't do that. That brings us to the two questions of this debate. The first and most important one on who has the mandate over FTAs, and the second, less important, on who has better FTAs. First, on who has the mandate. They conceded at first that expertise is not necessary to have voting rights, when they said that politicians don't need to have educational qualifications. That's why even though politicians are the ones who are going to be voting on FTAs on their side, they don't necessarily have to be qualified. How do they defend this? They shrunk back and said, wait, no, they have consultants. Let's address that, right? We told you that these consultants are generally lobbyists from MNCs, people who instill a confirmation bias in them, people who tell them this is the best deal ever, and that these people themselves come from elite backgrounds, and they're the ones who are likely to think that free trade is good because they benefit from it, but they don't recognize that other people don't. They fail to recognize, as politicians, that many people suffer as a result of FTAs, and they fail to stand up to the corporate lobby and defend those people's interests. That's what we pushed from first speaker. No response from them. That's why my deputy's substantive matters a lot as well, when he pointed out how corporations fund their re-election campaigns, how they provide them with all these advisors. They didn't provide any analysis onto why politicians would have a better mandate, except for the fact that they have a full-time job of doing this, and that somehow they can represent people better because they were elected. No analysis whatsoever on our criteria. The two criteria we very clearly set up at the beginning of the debate. We said first on the conflict of interest and second on the irreversibility. They had no response to irreversibility, by the way. That criteria stands to the end of this debate. But even on conflict of interest, the only thing they had to say was that they are elected, therefore they have a mandate. Like the president, like they should have the right to determine their own powers as well. This completely contravenes the principle of separation of powers that they thought they wanted to champion. Like when you have the fact that the government can restrict the powers of the judiciary, something we would never allow in a regular democracy, that's something they try to defend without giving any rights to the people to decide this. It's clear then that the only people who can have a mandate over FTAs are the people themselves. That's what we've been pushing. That's why we win this debate. But second, on which side has better FTAs? We clarified at first that we recognize that FTAs are going to happen, and the only difference we see is that the terms will be different. Like, for example,
Thanks to both teams, the judges will now complete their match and then the decision will be made. After a few minutes, they will return to the room to announce the result of the debate. Please stay in the